Well, good morning, everybody. Happy to be with you all in Goodland this morning. And so we'll jump into this. I just, as we think about manure, I like to start off with kind of thinking about the 4 R's of nutrient stewardship. So, making sure that we're utilizing the right source at the right rate, and then that it's being applied at the right time in the right place. And so I think there's some real opportunities to pair manure applications with a traditional soil fertility, traditional, commercial fertilizer products, and help to address some of the bigger challenges that we face if we were trying to do fertility just with manure. So as we think about the right source, what is that fertilizer that we need to achieve the goals? What are our existing soil conditions? What is the crop goal that we're using? When can we get that product? And that becomes a real challenge with manure. Are we getting it in the fall? Do we have to account for losses that are going to occur during the winter? Fertilizer delivery with commercial products and this year has certainly been an issue as well. Environmental risk. Now, we don't have the rainfall in western Kansas that we do in eastern Kansas, where we've got more water quality, surface water quality concerns to think about, but it is something that we should be keeping in the back of our mind. In terms of the right rate, what are your goals? If you have something, we were talking about iron chlorosis, is that what's really limiting and holding our potential back? Or is it phosphorus? Is it nitrogen? But thinking about, all of the nutrients that are required for good crop growth. And I think this is a real opportunity where manure plays a role, because not only are we getting the N and the P and the K out of that manure, but if you think about it from the animal feeding standpoint, they're feeding the animals lots of micronutrients in their ration to help their performance. Portion of those are passing through the animal, and we can take advantage of those micronutrients in the manure if it's part of our soil fertility program. Right time, with manure, if we can get it applied in the fall, if there's a tillage operation going on, that we can get some incorporation, start to get some decomposition going on. That certainly helps, but I wouldn't say that, if you can get manure and apply it in the spring, there is some of that nitrogen that's going to be available right away. And we'll go through here at the end some calculations on estimating nutrient availability in manure. So, we can find the right time, but we just need to think through how that affects everything else in our operation. And then the right place. What do we have for equipment? And this becomes the question with manure. Are there applicators that you can get a hold of that can get that product spread for you in a timely fashion? Do you still have some equipment for incorporation if you've converted to no-till? One of the things I get questions, I'm no-till, I don't want to necessarily till to utilize manure, and you don't have to till to utilize manure, but we do need to think about the stratification. I think manure, particularly if we're just doing surface broadcast applications of manure, we do run the potential over time to start to really increase that phosphorus stratification that Dorvar mentioned in his talk. So if you're utilizing manure, some occasional tillage that gives us a chance to incorporate some of that phosphorus that's stratified at the surface, maybe add lime if you're needing the lime, that starts to factor into the right place. So we'll just come back to that big picture to show how all of these puzzle pieces of source, rate, time, and place come together when we think about the 4 R's of nutrient stewardship. So thinking about manure and the challenge for agriculture, as we think about that application, we're obviously wanting to meet and achieve our yield goals. Manure does add that potential to return some carbon to the soil as organic matter. But when we move over to the waste disposal side of livestock manure, and this comes in, when we think about a feedlot operation that just has to figure out how they move manure from one place to the other to meet their nutrient management plan for their, whether they're a state registered or a federal permitted facility. When we start to get into that waste management, it becomes a risk management. How do we minimize loss but get the most nutrients applied? How do we minimize risk to water, air quality? And so this is where for row crop producers, there's opportunities if you're close to a feedlot to take advantage of that manure and really think about it as a fertilizer source in your operation that you may be able to get at a more economic price right now. With that, we've got to recognize that manure in terms of what the crop needs is unbalanced. And so we'll work through some numbers here in a minute, but what I mean by unbalanced is that nitrogen to phosphorus to potassium ratio that's in that manure doesn't match what the crop is looking at from a nutrient uptake standpoint. And so if you do a nitrogen-based application rate, you're going to exceed the phosphorus requirements for that crop. That's going to result in an increase in your soil test P over time. Now, if you haven't ever utilized manure or you only utilize manure, every 5 or 10 years, you're okay. And you're probably not going to build that phosphorus to a level of excess. But what I would contend is let's manage that manure based on a phosphorus rate. How many of you have had experience with manure on your operation? Well, a couple hands, okay. What's your experience been with nitrogen? Would you say you got what you hoped for out of the manure in terms of nitrogen supply to your crop? Okay. Timing becomes a factor in that. And it's, do you have the right conditions for that nitrogen to, the organic nitrogen to break down, to become, to break down and move into inorganic forms. So what I would say is apply on a phosphorus-based application rate and then supplement with commercial nitrogen, and that gets a bit of the risk management in there in taking care of the nitrogen that you need early on for your crop. And then as we get into conducive summer conditions for that manure to break down, we should see that nitrogen coming from the manure. And so just, end with, let's think about manure as part of the fertility program and break that thought process as we're just disposing of manure and getting rid of it. We want to take advantage of the nutrients that are in that manure. Any questions to this point? Yes, sir. A lot of that is going to depend on what your soil test values are. So if the feedlot, if you're associated with the feedlot, you're going to have to do soil testing. That's going to drive how that plan is developed and what those application rates are. If you're not associated with the feedlot can simply say they exported it, and then it's up to each individual producer to figure out their application rate beyond that point. And so I will go through some examples just based on crop removal at what some of those rates would be here in a minute, but it's hard to just say a blanket, this is how many tons you can apply, not knowing all of the other factors. So just some manure math. I think it's important to highlight these numbers. You may see manure reported in parts per million. You may see the manure values reported as a percent. So I've provided the easy conversions for you here so that, if you get those test results and you want to convert to pounds of nutrient per ton, you can do those conversions. And I put two other useful conversions up here, and that's the conversion from phosphorus. And many times labs are reporting on a phosphorus basis. You may be more familiar with working the math in terms of P2O5. So I've included those conversions there for you as well. And a little bit of this will come in here at the end of the session. So Alan Schlegel and team down at Tribune ran a 10-year manure fertility study. And so what I have pulled into the presentation here is some of the values that they've reported. So they applied every year for 10 years. And what I want to highlight is, so I've calculated the average value of that manure for the 10 years. And then I've included the minimum and maximum value. And so the average on total nitrogen was right about 30 pounds of nitrogen per ton. And this is for the feedlot manure. The minimum was 16, and that maximum was 40. So if you have an opportunity, let's say you're receiving feedlot manure and you're going to field stack that before it's applied, I'd strongly encourage you to test that manure, send some samples off, get an understanding of what the nutrient characteristics are, so you can determine a sound application rate. Organic average was 24.4, ranged from 16 to 30. Inorganic N average was 5. But the range was from 0.2 to 10. So, what we're seeing here is, average numbers kind of give us a ballpark, but knowing what you've actually got really factors into getting the most benefit out of that manure. Phosphorus ranged from 5 to 13 pounds of P per ton of that manure. And then he also had swine effluent. So that may be another option that you can get access to, would be swine effluent. Total N, we notice it's lower. It's about half of what they were seeing for that. Oh, geez. Big fingers. About half of what we were seeing for total nitrogen. But this one is higher in terms of inorganic nitrogen. So, that'll factor into when you would expect that nitrogen to become available for your subsequent crop. And in terms of this, it was a little lower on phosphorus. So the ration, the animal is going to play a role in the characteristics of the manure. Spent about 9 years at the University of Arkansas and did a lot of work with poultry litter. No, that's not a product that you're likely to get around here, although we have seen some poultry operations in Nebraska that are moving further west, so you may start to have some opportunities to get poultry litter. In terms of, I would put poultry litter kind of on the The far end of the spectrum in terms of, if we think about qualities of manure from a nutrient standpoint, tends to be a more nutrient dense manure. And we see that here, about 4% nitrogen, 1.6% phosphorus, 1.8% potassium. And then, we're getting some calcium, magnesium, carbon. Feedlot manure tends to be less nutrient dense, about a quarter of, in terms of the phosphorus, and the nitrogen about a quarter of what we would see in poultry litter. And those average numbers from Alan's study at Tribune, they fall pretty close to these book values that I've got summarized here as well. So really, as we think about starting to put a value on that manure, we're really focusing on that nitrogen and phosphorus, that potassium, and how does that mathematically work out. So I've run some numbers here looking at fertilizer prices, and I just pulled mid-November prices. At that point, we were around 85 cents per pound of N and per pound of P, about 40 cents per pound of K on that poultry litter. In the first year, we would say that has a value of $65 per ton. When we add in the residual nitrogen that's going to become available in subsequent years, that value based on NP and K goes up to 110. But we haven't put a value on the organic matter that's coming into our operation. We haven't put a value on all the micronutrients that are coming in. So I would say that value is 110 plus. Feedlot manure worked out to about a value of $16 a ton in the first year, 28 per ton when we account the residuals. But I would say that we can put a plus sign on that as well when we think about the return of organic matter and micronutrients. And so, this just kind of starts to give you some cost, if you're looking at, purchasing manure, it gives you an idea of some approximate values. And I'm more than willing to help anybody go through an economic calculation to see if that manure, based on a price that you've got is going to make sense. So just to highlight, we'll run through a couple scenarios for nitrogen-based versus phosphorus-based plans. And so I've just picked corn silage. I could have picked corn grain. I could have picked anything. But this was one I just ran for corn silage. Feedlot manure versus poultry litter, or that higher quality manure source. We've just set a yield of 20 tons to the acre, and that's going to give us an N uptake of 165 pounds to the acre. And what we see here is, in terms of the manure we're going to need to meet that nitrogen requirement, we're going to need about 10 tons to the acre for the feedlot manure scenario, and that's fresh feedlot manure, not composted. We're going to need 2.5 tons to the acre on the poultry litter. In terms of the P2O5 uptake, we're looking at 64 pounds to the acre. And so that works out to, we're going to meet that phosphorus need with either the feedlot or the poultry litter. We need 5.2 tons to the acre on the feedlot manure, 1.3 tons to the acre on the poultry litter. And I've made some assumptions, and that worksheet gives some of the discounts that we need to take for ammonia volatilization and availability. And I've taken those assumptions into account here in calculating these rates. So what we're looking at is that difference between the nitrogen-based and the P-based application. In terms of the feedlot manure, we're over applying just shy of 5 tons. In terms of the corn silage or the poultry litter scenario, we're over applying by about 1.2 tons. So, as we think about, how do we take best advantage of that manure, and how that fits into the overall bottom line of our operations, I would say if you're going to be a long-term manure user, I would strongly encourage you to apply on a phosphorus basis. If you're just going to use manure in the short term, I would still encourage you to do applications based on your phosphorus needs and then supplement with nitrogen. I think your manure experience is going to be more pleasant because you're not going to, it reduces your risk of not having the nitrogen available when the crop needs it. So, if we now start to think about that in terms of what's our nitrogen deficit, what do we need to add back in terms of commercial fertilizer? With these two scenarios, we're looking at needing to add back right around 80 pounds to the acre of nitrogen. And so at those prices, we're looking at somewhere in that neighborhood of $65 an acre in commercial nitrogen that we would need to add to the operation above what we paid for that manure. Just some other scenarios that I've put together over the years. Let's say you're getting manure and you want to apply once, say in a corn bean rotation or a wheat, double crop soybean corn, or maybe it's wheat, soybeans, corn spread out over 3 years. And these yield goals could be low, could be high. They're just numbers that at the time I calculated that seemed to make sense. Generally, what we're looking at in terms of a poultry litter need, we're needing somewhere in that 2 tons to the acre. And that would meet the phosphorus needs for the 2 years of that rotation. And so, that's where I think we've got some real opportunities with manure, is not to apply it every year, but find that spot in the rotation that makes sense to add that manure application and use that to meet the phosphorus needs for 2 or 3 years of the crop rotation. So Dorvar's covered a lot of that. We know the agronomic importance of phosphorus for root development, for the plant cell membrane and the energy function of the plant. We think about it as one of those immobile nutrients, so we need that in proximity to the root. And then from an environmental standpoint, now we don't have the risk of runoff here unless we get one of those crazy rains. What was it? Tribune got 10 inches in 24 hours last year. But generally, we don't have to worry about runoff. But, that's where concerns around phosphorus and other, the eastern side of the state, the other parts of the country comes into play. So we've seen this. Dorvar highlighted it in his presentation, and where we really want folks to focus is on this lower part of the curve, in this 30 parts per million and less. This is where we expect to see crop response. This is where we can really take advantage of the nutrients that are in manure. And once we cross over, we're moving into disposal. And I think about that disposal as, I'm a feedlot operator. I've got to deal with manure that's building up. Where within my permit can I apply that? And really that's disposal. We're not taking the best advantage of those nutrients, but that becomes the opportunity for our row crop producers in the state. With manure, certainly if you're in proximity to streams, waterways, thinking about having some buffer zone built in just prevents, in that event of a high intensity thunderstorm, unintended losses of those nutrients out of your field. And what we've got is, the recommended distance is 100 feet, 50 feet for intermittent streams. And we can decrease those with established buffers around our field that may have been paid for by, EQIP or some other conservation program. So as we think about wrapping up our discussion here on manure, some really key management considerations. Manure storage, because you may be able to get that manure at a time when you've got a crop on the field. So if you can kind of think through where it makes sense to stockpile that manure, you can get it at a discounted rate sometimes. So good access for whatever semi dump truck is hauling that manure product to your field, making sure that it's situated somewhere that's high, that's not going to hold water, that we've got sufficient crop ground around it to take advantage of any nutrients that run off the storage site. We want soils that have good infiltration so they're not ponding and holding water, but we do need to also think about groundwater. And then, with manure, soil testing is important. I'd encourage you to soil test all the time. Dorvar did not pay me to say that. But, with manure, making sure that we're soil testing, that we're managing our soil phosphorus is really important. Observing any setbacks that are needed. And then if it fits in your operation, incorporation within 24 hours is strongly recommended. The reason for that is around maximizing the nitrogen value in that manure. As we talked about with urea. Is urea in manure? Yes, no. Uric acid. There's urea in manure. So it has that potential to volatilize and be lost from that manure, just like the commercial urea products. So if we can incorporate, we can reduce that ammonia volatilization. If we can get it applied close to when the crop is going to be planted, that has some potential to take advantage of the inorganic nutrients and make sure that they're not leached and lost. Although out here, I think we'd be safe with fall applications. But then it's really, how do we minimize that ammonia volatilization from that manure and get that carried through the winter and available for the crop in the spring. So I've put the slide for the Tribune fertility study up there, and everybody hopefully picked up the solid manure nutrient credit worksheet. On the back page, it's blank. And I'm going to ask this side of the room to calculate the nutrient availability for the average. I'm going to ask the center of the room and take into consideration factors in your operation. So we're going to get a range of numbers for the average value. The center of the room is going to do the minimum. And again, take into consideration factors in your operation. And this side of the room is going to do the maximum number. And we're just going to then take an opportunity and kind of share what the range of values are that we can get. And so I'll just kind of talk through some things here. So the first thing that you're asked to calculate is the organic N. So we've got that as in terms of the average, that's 24, minimum 16, and the maximum was 30. And that's already pre-populated. Based on research and the work that Dale Lycum and Ray Lehman did back in the 90s, we would put an estimated availability at 25% on that. That's what's going to be available in the first year after application from that organic N. So now you can plug those your appropriate number in and calculate your available pounds per ton of organic coming from the organic N. How are those? How's that first calculation coming along? Does this side of the room have a number for the average organic N? 6.1, is there agreement? Yep, that works. How about middle of the room for the minimum? 4, okay. And this side for the max? Huh? 7.5, yep. So we've got from 4 to 7.5, at average being about 6.1. So now the next one is the inorganic N. Most of that is going to be in the form of ammonia. And so again, we've got those ranges here, the inorganic N, 5.1, 0.2, and 10.6. And this is where we can start to get some variability, because to figure out your nutrient availability factor, it's going to depend on when you're going to incorporate that. So table 2 has some values around, and you'll be looking at the right side. So days after application till incorporation. I will say we're in the process of revising this for Western Kansas. The values that are presented here are, I think, more severe than really what we're actually seeing coming out of manure. But we are still working on consensus around what those futures should look like. So we're going to use this as is today. So I'll let you guys do a little bit of math on that. And I am here if you have questions along the way. I'll start over on this side. Is anybody ready to present? Share a number? Give you a few more minutes. And I should have said, for folks on Facebook that want to pull up this worksheet, go to the K-State bookstore and look for K-State publication PM 48. Just Google KSRE PM 48. All right. What do we have here? Anybody got a number for the inorganic nitrogen? Nine and a half. Okay. How about the middle of the room, the low end? Point 0.18. No, we're not. Not much. How about the average folks here? 3.3. Yep. So again, how we're managing that manure from application, or how we're going to manage that manure at that field after application, can affect the availability of the inorganic portion, but also the variability in the manure itself. Again, it comes back to testing and knowing what you're getting, so that you can develop a good fertility plan. The final one, so we can add those up. When I did the calculations for the average, we were at 9.4 pounds of nitrogen per ton of manure. So the next one is the phosphorus, and we've got two scenarios that we've used historically. We've used for soils with a very low and low soil test P. We've assumed a 50% availability of that manure P. And then for medium to high testing soils, we've assumed 100% availability. And so with that and knowing your ground, let's go ahead and calculate the phosphorus availability in the year of application. How are we coming on the phosphorus calculations? Got a number? What is it? 4.57. 4.57. Okay. That's assuming 50%, so low soil test P. And anybody run it on, well, obviously we know what high would be. That'd be 9.1. So how about for our minimum value? Still see some pencils moving. 2.6. Okay. How about for our max value over here? Anybody run it for 50%? Okay. So again, this highlights that we've got a range of availabilities and that we need to think about when we're calculating our manure application rate. This tool is here to help you. We are in a modernization process that Dorvar and I are hoping to get finished by early spring. Fingers crossed. We're under a deadline. So this will be moving to an online format that'll be available through K-State Soil Testing so that you don't have to go to the paper copy. You can plug your numbers in and that will tie into the overall nutrient planning worksheet that is also available through K-State Soil Testing. So that is what I've got to share today. So PM48 is solid. We also currently have PM49. If you have access to a liquid manure, that worksheet will help you through liquid calculations. So with that, I am happy to take any questions and hopefully we're staying fairly close to on time. Okay. We can go back, so we can circle back to your question. So it was, what's an application rate for feedlot manure? I would say, you know, again, it's what crop. I mean, my calculations on that corn silage is around 10 tons to the acre to meet the nitrogen needs every year. But it's half to meet the phosphorus needs. So you'd be 5 tons to the acre. If you were looking to only apply once every 2 years, with that corn silage scenario, you could get by with the 10 tons to the acre. You know, that's going to give you nitrogen in theory in 1 year, but there is risk in that because that, depending on if it's really dry, we're not going to get some of the manure decomposition. That nitrogen may not be there for the crop. So that's where I approach it from, let's meet the phosphorus needs that we've got greater certainty about their availability to the next crop and supplement with some commercial nitrogen to help reduce that risk. The only situation where you're going to come into regulations on application rates is if you are connected with a confined animal feeding operation or a state permitted facility. And all of those are already going to have nutrient management plans in place, either for their federal CAFO confined animal feeding operation permit, or if they're less than 999 head, their state permit. If you're not associated with that as a row crop producer, you're not held to any standard. That's going to come down to the field that you're applying on and what the soil test values are. For Western Kansas, under the right scenario, there is not a limit until on phosphorus, I believe it's 200 parts per million malic 3. But again, that should all be spelled out in your permit and associated nutrient management documents.
Well educated. I've read my management plan several times. I don't see any of that language.
Okay. Well, we can visit afterwards about that.
More questions?
Yes.
Do you know the sampling method on the 10-year study? Was it fresher manure or was it piled manure that sat there for a few months?
I'm going to defer to Lucas on that since he was actually working at Tribune at that time.
It wasn't composted per se, but it wasn't completely fresh. There had been stockpiled fruit or something. That's how not fully composted.
Yeah.
It's I would, from what I've read about it, it sounds like it's, it'd be those, pen scrapings piled at the field edge prior to application. So you've had some decomp going on in the pile. Other questions?
It was
Yes.
all fairly relative to time. It wasn't like we had a pile of fruit out of
Right.
you get fresh out of the feedlot. What are some of the costs that you're hearing feedlots are selling that? I know they're not giving it away.
I was going to ask you all that question if anybody was hearing costs, because I have not heard. I don't tend to hear feedlot costs. I tend to hear more of the costs around the poultry litter on the eastern side of the state.
Say that again.
$5 a ton. And that is important to think about, is what is your freight cost? That's one of the challenges that does hold back manure utilization, is what it costs to freight it. Has anybody else heard a recent cost on feedlot manure? You been hearing anything, Lucas?
Hear lots of numbers out of lots.
But again, if we come back to those calculations that I did on kind of a book value for that feedlot manure, you could be looking at, somewhere in that $16 to $25 nutrient value. But then you've got to factor in, does your hauling cost plus the cost of the product, does that make sense on your balance sheet?
Does the hauling cost include spreading?
That's another huge variable. I mean, I know there are some outfits out there that will haul and spread as a package price, but again, that's going to depend on who you can find to do it. All right.
Okay, thank you, Peter.